Testing, testing. Welcome, everyone. I believe we have audio and video. We have eyes on YouTube. So welcome, everyone, to our second symposium. We hosted one back in August, and we're back today. For those watching after the fact, it is February 29th, Leap Day 2024. My name is Camden Busey, and I am the Executive Director of Reformed Forum. I'm delighted to be with you today and to discuss a variety of things. We have put together a wonderful, in my opinion, a wonderful symposium with 3 sessions. Our title for the event today is Crossroads of Conviction, a symposium on the intersection of theology and public discourse. We've been working hard. It takes a lot of time and effort to put these things together, and we're delighted to do it. And we're happy today to be presenting to you 3 sessions. Our first session we'll get to in a minute features our guest, Joseph Minik, to speak about his book. I've got a copy of it with me here, Bulwarks of Unbelief, Atheism and Divine Absence in a Secular Age. It's published by Lexham Press, Lexham Academic more specifically, that imprint. We've got a coupon code for you. I'll mention it later, but before I forget, I'll make sure I at least mention it right now. Go to Lexham Press, that's LEXHAMPRESS.com, LexhamPress.com/reformed-forum, Reformed Forum with a dash, and you'll find a coupon there where you can get 40% discount, receive a 40% discount and free U.S. shipping on Bulwarks of Unbelief, our book today, and I'm sure you're going to want to get a copy, especially after you hear Joseph present. I have really enjoyed this book. I'm looking forward to hearing Joseph's presentation and some interaction among various scholars and pastors as they have questions. And all of you who are watching on YouTube can comment as well and remark about how it's going, and if you have any questions for our presenter. So our first session, we're going to begin here in just a few minutes. It's roughly 11 a.m. Eastern time. Following that, we are going to have at 2 p.m. Eastern, so after a little bit of a break between this session and the next, we will welcome Owen Anderson. Owen teaches philosophy and religious studies at Arizona State University. He's also a pastor of Historic Reformed Church. I might be getting that wrong. It's a historic church in Phoenix, Arizona area. I think it might technically be in Peoria. Not Peoria, Illinois, where I used to live, but Peoria, Arizona. I'll have those details in place before his session begins. But Owen will explore the phenomenon of secularization, particularly focusing on the transformative changes that took place at Princeton Seminary and within Presbyterian education. That, again, is at 2 p.m. Eastern. And then we will round off the day with a book panel discussion, and this was the first panel that we had scheduled, so we've kind of built this entire event around this session, but I'm not saying it's better than the others. It's just different. And the first one that was presented or scheduled, we're going to have a book panel discussion on Alan Strange's new book, Empowered Witness, Politics, Culture, and the Spiritual Mission of the Church. So with that theme in mind, we went with the Crossroads of Conviction idea and built out a panel. And we're so happy to have Owen and Joseph with us today to speak on different perspectives on a similar general theme. But in our book panel on Empowered Witness, the panel will discuss Alan's book here. They're going to examine Alan Strange's exploration of the spirituality of the church doctrine, which is a pivotal biblical concept developed specifically in the 19th century, more thoroughly in the 19th century. And then they will discuss its relevance in today's politically charged environment, emphasizing the necessity for the church to prioritize its spiritual mission over earthly, political, and social agendas. Strange's book is a call to refocus the church's work on the Great Commission. So we'll have several theologians and historians to comment on the book, including Timon Klein from American Reformer, Daryl Hart from Hillsdale College, and C.N. Wilborn from Greenville, as well as some other places. He's a pastor in the PCA, and Oak Hill down in Tennessee. And those 3 men will come with prepared comments. They've read the book. They're going to come and present their comments and critique on Alan's work. And then Dr. Strange will have the opportunity to respond to those comments and critique, and we'll open the floor up for a general discussion on the topic. So these are the things that we scholars do. We discuss books and we discuss ideas and we challenge one another in the pursuit. This is all done, we hope and pray, with the goal of gaining greater knowledge, sharpening one another, even in our thinking, and pursuing the truth through discourse. So that's what we're aiming at today, hopefully to spread our wings a bit at Reformed Forum. We love these events because they're helping us. We believe this is a strategic initiative that helps us to live up to our name. We are Reformed Forum, and we're seeking to share our particular theological distinctives. Everyone knows we love Voss, we love Van Til, we love redemptive historical theology, but we're seeking to do that in a wider and greater conversation with Reformed ecumenical tradition, as well as traditions even outside that, wider than that. So today we have mostly, pretty much all an in-house discussion, so to speak, at least within the Reformed world, but nevertheless different perspectives and different voices outside of what people might think of Reformed Forum more narrowly. But the hope is here we'll have a wonderful, fun, casual, even though scholarly, but still fun and exciting conversation on these various topics. If anyone has any questions, you can head on over to community.reformedforum.org and ask them there. If you need something quick, please post it into the YouTube chat if you're watching there, or if we have our participants and panelists and various scholars and faculty that might be watching on Zoom in the closed group, you can comment on there. We have staff members that are watching the comment threads, and they'll be able to respond. If none of those work, then please send us an email at mail@reformedforum.org, and we'll also monitor the inbox for that. If you have my phone number, unless you're a speaker or presenter, please don't ask me questions on my text because I'm going to be busy and trying to concentrate. So anyway, I kid. And now that I've said that, Joseph, I'm sure tons of people are going to be blowing up my phone just to drive me crazy. So I might have to put it in Do Not Disturb for a few minutes. But with all that being said, let me introduce to you our guest today. We have with us Dr. Joseph Minik, who's a teaching fellow with the Davenant Institute. He is the founding editor of Ad Fontes, their journal. It's so beautifully laid out, and there's so many good things always presented there. He's also the editor of several volumes with the Davenant Press. And again, most significantly for this morning, the author of Bulwarks of Unbelief, Atheism and Divine Absence in a Secular Age, with a foreword from our friend and my former professor, Carl Trueman. So Joseph, welcome to our symposium. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to your presentation. I'll let you take it over from here.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Camden, for this event. This is a really neat event, and I love seeing the Reformed world create ecosystems of talented intellectuals coming together to talk. That's a really neat initiative, and thanks for this invitation to come and talk to all of you. As Camden just mentioned, I was invited to talk about my recent book, Bulwarks of Unbelief, Atheism and Divine Absence in a Secular Age. And really what I'm going to do, as opposed to kind of a chapter-by-chapter summary of the book, is just for 20 minutes or so, I'll kind of give a layout of the overall argument and then, kind of toss it to the gallery, I suppose, to interact about the basic thesis and clarify where I can clarify, essentially. Right. So the book is the culmination of an attempt to really think about two things. Most of it grows out of two fairly basic things. I wrote a smaller earlier work called Enduring Divine Absence, which is kind of the 100-page version of the argument, though not as developed as it became in Bulwarks of Unbelief. But those two things, I'll mention those and then work through the argument a bit. The first thing I'm trying to understand is the relationship between the rise of atheism in the modern world, the proliferation that atheism is just, a possible option for people to take, and the frequently expressed sensation that God is absent in some way, whether that be expressed in film or literature or philosophy or whatever, just this discourse around this agitation about this issue of divine absence. And in the sense in which I'm using the term divine absence, you might substitute in a lot of cases something like divine non-obviousness. and maybe even divine non-obviousness on like a sensorial level. That is to say, for modern people, it can be a motivation to atheism or just a personal crisis. That God's being, in some sense, does not feel quite as obvious as, for instance, the fact that I'm talking to you right now, or that there's a tree outside my window, or something like that. And there's a bunch of arguments to get around that. Nevertheless, the very fact of that one thing feels more viscerally obvious than the other, can be a source of anxiety for Christians. And I'm trying to, or a motivation in a lot of cases for atheism positively. And I'm trying to kind of capture where did that association kind of build, as it were. And then secondly, I'm going to back up and just bracket that for a second. Again, I think that's something I'm wanting to point out, something that's common between believers and unbelievers, even if it's something that motivates atheism in a lot of cases. It's often the case that a believer, even who's very persuaded about God's existence, whether it be, I'm persuaded through the Van Tillian way, or I'm persuaded because of Aquinas's 5 proofs, or whatever it is that makes you persuaded in the mind that God exists. There can be a juxtaposition between that inner persuasion in the mind and some lingering sense of reality that goes, yeah, but does that actually work before you go to sleep at night? So that's one cluster of things I'm trying to kind of philosophically and maybe phenomenologically analyze. What is that experience? What's going on inside of it? And then second is the question of, how does modern technology, I use this term technocultural order, how does modern technology and labor patterns and the community systems we have, is there a sense in which those posture us toward reality, shape the kind of tacit way we perceive things in such a way that perhaps accounts for this link, as it were, the particular textures that crisis over divine absence takes? Here's another way of saying that. Is there something in the techno-labor culture order, as it were, that shapes our perceptions of reality, the very way we ask the questions at the imagination level? Is there something going on there that accounts for what's going on in that bucket one, as it were? So as I said, I'm not going to proceed chapter by chapter to say exactly how I try to lay that all out. I think maybe a better way to get at it is just to kind of compare my argument to a more familiar argument to most people at this point, which is Charles Taylor's argument in A Secular Age. And I think that'll more or less make the thesis relatively clear. For those with ears to hear, of course, the very title, Bulwarks of Unbelief, is a riff on Taylor. Taylor has this mammoth chapter in A Secular Age called Bulwarks of Belief. And effectively, just to summarize Taylor's project, you might think of Taylor's project as comparing two dates, the year 1500 AD and the year 2000 AD. And the basic idea is, hey, in 1500 AD, look, you could be a heretic, you could think all sorts of funny business, but the idea that God didn't exist was just barely or not an option for anybody in 1500 AD. By the time you get to 2000 AD, not only is it an option, it's an option that even the most fervent believers who go through all the arguments can struggle with in some way. And so what, in a sense, in the background noise has shifted to get from A to B? And that's Taylor's argument. And so for Taylor's secularization, or the condition of being in a secular age, is the condition in which more or less belief in God feels like, whatever your mind says, it kind of feels like one option among many options. That's effectively the narrative Taylor's setting up. He focuses mostly on the development of what he's going to call the modern moral order, but he does identify the middle to the late 19th century as this catalyst moment, this very significant moment where there's a shift in direction in some way. There's a bunch of stuff that comes before the 19th century. That's why the book is 800 pages long. But he nevertheless does identify the capacity to fully kind of exercise, as it were, God from the imagination becomes more or less a common possibility toward the end of the 19th century. Mostly what I'm trying to do in my book, in some sense, is I don't disagree as much with Taylor's argument. I'm trying to supplement Taylor's argument and fill out the explanation. Saying that you're tweaking Charles Taylor, of course, is something that you can do precisely because he's not in the room and he's not going to object to all the things that I said about his book. But yeah, I'm supplementing Charles Taylor in the book by focusing on the two things I've already mentioned. Effectively, what role not just does the modern moral order, but what role does kind of urbanized existence and then eventually suburbanized existence and the vast proliferation of post-industrial technology and the common labor patterns that exist within that social order, how do all those things help give shine a light, as it were, on the significance of this particular period, that late 19th century period, which is where we see this stuff rise. And then divine absence, I supplement Taylor as well by arguing that getting at this issue of divine absence, which has always been a problem, but always a theodicy problem. It's a where's God when I'm suffering problem. But in the modern world, it takes on a why can't I see God nature, and that aspect of it gets added to this divine absence discourse. And I'm the other supplementation to Taylor, in addition to taking the tech angle, is this angle of what is it about that? Does that experience, that particular, in a sense, illuminate the whole in some way? So to get at the argument and effectively how I play that argument out, what I'll do is just kind of do another version of Charles Taylor and say, let's use our imagination for a second. Imagine a couple things about the year in 1500 AD, use our imagination again and imagine a couple of things in the year 2000 AD. And really what I'm looking for here is, put on your thinking cap and you want to, in third grade nomenclature, and imagine something that becomes very different in these two periods relative to the way in which the world communicates to me, the way in which my community communicates to me, and the way in which I interact with myself. Another way of saying that is, another way of prompting the question is to say, in what sense does the world in the pre-modern experience manifest as an agent? In what sense does my community manifest in active agentic ways? And in what ways do I experience my own agency? And then we'll contrast that kind of to the 2000 side of the equation. And effectively what I'm trying to point out in the book is part of the reason, at least in my judgment, I suspect you really don't have the plausibility of atheism in the pre-modern period. It's not because everybody read Thomas Aquinas. It's not because the average folk Christian knew the five proofs really well. It was arguably because of very basic postures toward the world. And so going through those three things, if you can imagine the average subsistence existence since time out of mind, and certainly in the year 1500 AD, the average human subsistence existence is an existence where the forces of the world insist themselves upon you. Hills, and animals and trees and storms populate your experience, but they populate your experiences as agents, in a sense, actors upon you around which you have to navigate. There's a stubborn quality to an enormous amount of, again, I don't know how to put it, like chorus of communicators rather than an amalgam of machine parts is one way to put it. There's a chorus of communicators out there, and at the very basic default tacit textures of my experience, to live a subsistence existence is to be interacting with those forces in a way that puts you in intimate contact with them as agents acting upon you in your community. Bracket that. You add to the side, the experience of a given community for most of history is not such that you can just get in an automobile and change communities or unfriend on Facebook or something like that, right? If you're born in a small tribe of 300 to 400 persons or a town of 1,000 people or something like that, your ability to just switch communities, your ability to evade the stubborn bodies and the way that they act around you is nearly impossible and not a given part of human experience. And so your experience of the community is as a collection of agents, as it were, that insist themselves upon you. But then in most previous experiences of the world as well, you likewise have your experience of your own agency. And a bracketed comment, none of this is to sentimentalize the past. I don't want to live in 1500 AD. I like living now. When I talk about connection to your own agency in the past, I don't mean to sentimentalize the kind of labor. Life was hard. But what you can say is that in a small community, it's very clear pretty quickly what you're good at it's probably going to be used, and you know exactly why you're doing it. You know, you might hate farming, but you also know exactly why you're farming. I'm putting my hands in the soil and growing things because if I don't, we're all going to die. And so the kind of intrinsic connection to your agency in communication with the agency of others and in the agency of the world is just a manifest piece of reality to you. And in a sense, all we need to ask is, what does the cosmos, as it were, manifest as or tacitly seem like in the mirror of that collection of agencies? And you might say that it's very natural to think in that context of the reality as just involving agency and mind and personhood all the way down. That, as it were, this chorus of communicators bottoms out in a communicator, capital C, as it were. That doesn't need to be a philosophical argument. It's almost written into the natural interpretive motions of the mind, as it were, for somebody living in that kind of context. So you bracket that out, go to modern experience, and look at those same three things. Your experience of the world and the agency of the world is highly bracketed out in post-industrial life, such that trees and hills, mountains are things I can just move through and around without that. Their agency is still there, but I don't have to attend to it, and I'm certainly not forced to attend to it. And when you really kind of work out, you know, think of modern grocery stores, relationship to food and animals and all these things, when you really kind of fill out the amount of things that for our ancestors, weather, you know, a huge storm that would have been a crisis for our ancestors, for us is something that I can experience from inside, and it's just a pretty storm, and my electricity is still going to work afterwards, usually. And so the kind of agency of the world is still there, but it's bracketed from your attention. The world becomes tacitly coded as a kind of passive receptacle of whatever I want it to be, that basically. Add community dimensions to that. In the post-industrial order, you think of, you know, the era of the automobile. You think of the capacity, once you have automobiles, that you're not choosing between three stubborn communities in a, or three churches with stubbornly fixed communities within walking or wagon distance, but 3,000 churches within driving distance. And that's just one piece of many pieces of your relationship to your community. And it's quite possible, in fact, to live a functioning, quote, quote, functioning life in the modern world, and nevertheless to not be able to avoid, in a sense, those stubborn features of your community. And so another way of saying that is the agency of your community is, in some sense, an elective thing you relate to. You can pull away from the stubborn agencies of the community that act on you. And then you add, and this is maybe where the book is the most, maybe where the argument gets somewhat unique, is the sense of one's own agency in modern labor. That sense that there's so much that's been written about this in novel and in film and some analysis of, you know, existential problems in work, but we have a lot of high competence producing individuals who nevertheless don't feel like they fully understand how what they do plugs into the many pieces of the bureaucratic chain that exists at their own company, nor how their own company fits into the commonwealth. And so there's this high degree of competence, but this lost sense of how what I am doing connects to anything. And so you might say it this way, now contrasting the three bits, the agency of the world kind of buffered over, the agency of the community kind of buffered over, and now my own very active agency, you know, that ground zero in a sense of agency carried or kind of blurred over, such that people speak of themselves as kind of being passengers in their own life, carried along in their very own activity, you know. And so what does the whole show look like in that fun house of foggy gray mirrors? Well, if it's agencyless all around me in the textures of things, it's not shocking that the sensation is that it sort of bottoms out, or that perhaps it all kind of plausible at the imaginarium level, that it bottoms out in agencyless all the way down, which I think gives that set of experiences, I think gives some explanation, again, to that experience where the mind can still retrace the arguments. The mind can go read your Aquinas or read your Van Til and say, that's a good argument. I see them pointing to real things. That's the right conclusion. And yet then you go back to this practical engagement with things, and there's something almost written in the very fabric of it that's in tension with what are otherwise conclusions of the mind. And I think that puts in context, in a sense, what we're experiencing. So by 3/4 of the way through the book, effectively what I've just said is the argument. But then there is a fourth chapter where, I get into the to the practical side of things, I suppose. It's sort of like, yeah, that's nice, great, we have an explanation for why we struggle with these things, but an explanation is only so helpful. What do we do about it, right? And so I'll just gesture for a moment. One of the things I think it helps us see is that there are arguments that we need to kind of go back to when things weren't this way. I think if the features I've identified are some of the features that are putting us in these conditions, I think one of the things that we're helped to see is how deep in the fabric of our social habits these tendencies emerge, how deep in our social habits we're experiencing some shift underneath, such that it manifests in the kind of tensions we're talking about. In other words, this is not simply a matter of going and tweaking and fixing ideas. Sometimes there's this sense that we can just return to the past, and that that's really about getting your ideas straight, and somehow the social order will just kind of epiphenomenally manifest on top of dotting your I's and crossing your T's. And I think, in other words, we tend to be ideologues. We tend to be ideological in our very our instincts about what it is to fix these things. And I guess what I'm trying to do is point to something more subterranean and say we can't really go back. Part of what I want to do in the book is point at the problems, say, yeah, of course there's something we have to do about this, but also remain hopeful that there's something providential about being in the trial of modernity, as it were. A lot of my more current writing is on interpreting modernity and exactly what is modernity. And my leading lights there are folks like Herman Bavinck and C.S. Lewis, who experienced the shift underneath their feet of the modern order, but really firmly believe the only direction is that way. The only direction is actually to move through all these providential movements God has given us, to remain oriented to those things relative to which maybe we don't feel the kind of gravity that we do in a more traditional order. But nevertheless, what's on the other side of this is going to be free human craft, the re-gravitational pull of kind of the natural order, you might say. I'd add to that, I think it's also crucial to point out that we can sometimes, and this is part of the chapter as well, we can sometimes valorize what the past was. So you compare, we're just aware of where all the bodies are buried in the year 2024, right? But we forget where all the bodies were buried in the year 1500 AD. And so when you start to play it out and you say, like, how much of an advantage in terms of godliness, in terms of like, I'd want to live there and it was a beautiful social order, was it for everybody to just simply believe in God, for that signal to be clear? Well, the Middle Ages were not renowned for their godliness, and Old Testament Israel, was not renowned for its godliness. And so, in some sense, the perception of what will fix things, it seems to me, can be unrealistically applied and again thought of overly ideologically, as though if we just get these data points right, somehow what's phenomenally going to flow from that is a fixed culture. And I think that's a naive way to think about it. And so what I try to argue in the kind of concluding section of the book is just a sort of, well, here we are. This is just the situation that we've inherited. We've all been very deeply affected by it in subterranean regions, such that we just are these people. We're not traditional people plus a modern situation added into it. We're all very, very modern people in ways that we perhaps don't even fully recognize. And also that's okay, and that God can guide us to be faithful in that context. And there is a way to have a civilizational project, to think about these as problems, really be working towards solutions, but also not be thinking like ideologues about it. And so that's sort of where the book ends, is to sort of say, here's my explanation of some of the things that are going on in the modern world. But I don't want to end on a sour note. Nor an overly optimistic note, but I do want to end on a hopeful note, because hope is a virtue whose object is God, not the imminent forces of the world. And I think there is just reason to be hopeful for the church, and even for civilization writ large in a lot of ways. And so that's effectively the end of the book. Really briefly, by way of conclusion, since then I've been trying to pull out what's implicit in this book and work it out a little bit more. And the definition of modernity I've been playing with, that I think just for purposes of discussion, I think captures what I think our situation is in a sentence. In a sense, you could imagine, take Taylor. Taylor wants to say that what is it to be in a secular age? Well, it's to be in a condition where belief in God is one option amongst many options. And I think we could get a pretty good definition of modernity by expanding that analysis to say, how many things are like that aren't just religion? My default gender, my default family structure, my default community, my church, my confessional background. And I could just go through thing after thing after thing in the modern world and say, there is nothing, not just your religion, but there are very few things that don't feel like one option among many options. And that is actually also something that's extended all over the developed world, such that one way of looking at modernity would just be to say, and here's handy dandy definition, it's not trademark, use it however you want, but the simultaneous global renegotiation of all human custom. I think whatever it is to say we live in the late modern world is to say that we live in the simultaneous global renegotiation of all human custom, which doesn't mean we've lost the natural gravity of things or that doesn't exist, but the signals are a bit obscured, and returning to those or being oriented by them is a challenge. So, yep, that's effectively the argument. And yeah, I guess I'll toss it back to the gallery for questions or thoughts.
Well, thank you, Joseph. I'm flipping back the cameras and making sure everything's working for everyone. I love that. Thank you for that succinct summary of the book. Again, we're talking about Bulwarks of Unbelief by our guest today, our presenter, Joseph Minik. And we've got coupon codes for that available in the YouTube chat, you'll see, but head on over to lexumpress.com/reformed-forum to get 40% off, a 40% discount, and free U.S. shipping. So I'm looking at the panel and keeping my eye on participants and for folks to raise their hand. But in the meantime, I've got a bunch of questions, Joseph, just to keep the conversation going. We'll start maybe with some that are a little bit more germane before I get into my weird stuff. This is the part of the symposium where everyone brings their pet ideas, right? Like, so I'm gonna keep my pet idea till later, and allow the actual germane organic ideas to come forth first. So one thing that struck out to me, and I was obviously I was very interested when you were interacting with Charles Taylor's book. That's a very popular book. A lot of people know about that, but you start to bring in and develop some other ideas, some thinkers that people might not know. And I don't think people will understand right away just by looking at this book. They might get a sense of it from your presentation, but just how wide sweeping this is. I mean, you definitely are a student and a scholar of intellectual history. So you're all over the place, but not in a way that's scattered at all. It's all with a purpose and an intention. So I want to commend you on that, because I don't see books like that very often, and maybe it's because that's not my particular field. If I'm reading, it's in dogmatics or historical theology, so right. I don't read books like this as often as I ought, but I very much enjoyed it. But you brought in this notion of modern technoculture, and you argue that the intersection of modern technoculture and alienated labor contributes significantly to the sense of divine absence. I'm wondering if you might be willing to elaborate on how specific technological advancements have reshaped our existential and our theological questions. What is it about modern life? We're obviously modernity. We're all renegotiating constantly human custom. But let's zoom in, if we might, on some technological examples and reframing, reshaping some of our ideas. I guess I'm channeling my inner Neil Postman.
Yeah, no, that's a really that's a great question. And yeah, really what the book tries to do is, and this is where it gets kind of in the weeds, you might say, is look at, in a sense, the question becomes, how does the technology, maybe not directly, but, think about, automobiles, think about buildings, think about architecture, think about electricity, you put all that, and especially the internet and social media eventually, but it's what kinds of habits, mental and spiritual habits of attention do we tend to develop within that context? And so, does the world of technology um, attune us to the world in such a way that um, the standard unit of reality that is the most real to us is material reality, is manipulable, the reality of objects, so to speak, in the sense of that thing in front of me right now. And does that becoming, again, not even necessarily intellectually, but sort of tacitly, my paradigm of what it means for a thing to be real? That's one way to put it. How does the experience of these things gesture us implicitly to have a kind of unspoken answer about what it even means for a thing to be real? And my sense is that the habit of mind that we tend to drift in without naming it is what it means for a thing to be real paradigmatically is real, the way these keys right here are real, is something like that. And so God then kind of has to kind of hinge himself to reality by virtue of that thing that feels and seems more real like to us. And so technology, I'm kind of arguing, how do technology and labor work together to posture us toward reality such that at the basic imaginative feedback loop between our active movements in the world and the sense of what the whole show is like, in a sense, that feedback loop, I think, through our habits of attention in the modern technocultural order, are such that you might say that God signals are obscured, or God as the paradigm of reality is obscured in the imagination. I don't know if that answers the question, but
I think so. I think it's quite interesting. I also see some themes that you develop in the book, and they're readily, I think, understood by a lot of people just implicitly in the world, even if they haven't thought about them at an intellectual level or articulated their beliefs. But postmodernity, and especially with the rise of so many advanced technological developments, we live in this tech culture, and we have this basically technicism. I mean, that's kind of the dominant, at least in my opinion, in the Western world, kind of the dominant religion. Like, it's an anthropocentrism that eventually human beings will figure out everything. I mean, so many billionaires in Silicon Valley are devoting quite a bit of money to solving the problem of death. Now, I'm all for the Sixth Commandment, and the Sixth Commandment is all about not just not murdering, and not killing, but promoting life. So I'm all for that in terms of healthcare and extending lifespan. But the goal there isn't understood within a Christian worldview. The idea is basically to conquer death and to become immortal gods. Or you think of a guy like Ray Kurzweil. I don't know if you know him. He used to work at Google, but he's a futurist. But he's written these wild books like The Age of Spiritual Machines and all these kinds of stuff. Like he's on the forefront of this transhumanism movement that humankind can eventually transcend their biology through technology. So obviously when you see what we've been able to do in the last 10, 20, 50 years, I mean, we've lived through just so much advancement with the internet and whatnot. You can see where the modern mind is starting to, like, why do we need God? Like, we explain all this stuff, and if we can't explain it yet, just wait 5 years. Maybe we'll explain it then. Do you see those features playing in as well, making it difficult?
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's really helpful. Bringing in kind of transhumanism is really helpful because there's thought experiments that I think it generates that also help us see, like, what gets weird. So actually, I'll stop self-editorializing there and just come up with a scenario. Would it be relieving? Here's an interesting question relative to this theme of divine absence. Would it be relieving if, Monty Python style, I don't mean to be reverent here, but, the clouds peel back once a day and the Shekinah, the glory comes out and it's like, here I am, guys. And then the clouds shut. And then God showed up once a day and everybody saw him, as it were.
Right.
A lot of people feel like, oh, well, if that happened, of course, everybody would believe in God.
No.
But if you play out, even if that were true, even if it were true that technically everybody would believe in God at that point, it's interesting that what I just described is actually no different than an imagined transhumanist future for humans. In other words, how do you distinguish a bright floating head in the sky from what is from if you put your sci-fi hat on,
Right.
from what an intelligence could achieve simply through the material order. And one of the things that helps us do is to say, when we're looking for the presence of God, what are we looking for?
Mm.
Are we looking for just one really bigger, more powerful object amidst objects? Or, and this is where I think actually this kind of thought experiment helps us get back to the more ancient Christian notion that we genuinely do know God through creatures. That is to say, there's one sense in which the only option for God to display himself and his existence to the consciousness of his creatures is just the canvas of creation itself, because he's not a creature. And so there's no floating face in the sky, as it were, that's going to that is a proof that's becoming a divine presence, as it were, to answer all questions of divine absence. There's a way in which that sensation of the kind of presence you're looking for, in a sense, is missing the question, in a sense, and missing what it means to say God and not a creature.
Yeah, I love that. I find that very useful. We got a question from Carlton Wynn. I'm going to wait till he gets his
Oh,
tech working.
beautiful.
Oh, I can hear Carlton. I can't see him. So it's up to you, Carlton, whether you want to turn your video on, but I'll let you interact with Dr. Minich.
Okay, I might be able to get my video on, but can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay,
Yep.
great. Well, yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. I just have a question as y'all are talking about advancing technology. One thing you may not have mentioned is artificial intelligence, and I'm thinking about how many sociologists are talking about the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, and how they are more spiritual than sometimes they're given credit for. It's sort of a patchwork spiritualism, and thinking about artificial intelligence and just the way that it's opening up all kinds of wild, creative spaces. My question is, will artificial intelligence, and especially its creative power, subvert the kind of naturalistic worldview, closed off heavens, or will it serve to promote transcendent things, or will it do so in an unhelpful way, in a kind of pagan counterfeit kind of way?
Yeah, that is such a money question, a good cluster of questions. Many observers of the current situation have observed there is a tendency in many respects away from a kind of crass materialism and naturalism as such, uh, perhaps toward a one that has more vague things like forces in it and that sort of thing. In both Silicon Valley and in New York and all these sorts of things. Here, I'm thinking of something like Tara Isabella Burton's book, Strange Rites, The New Religions of a Godless Age. That's a really excellent analysis of what you might say are more kind of witchy things going on in the modern world. And some analysts, even like L.M. Sakassis, in his recent article he wrote a few years ago, The Analog City and the Digital City, uh, takes Taylor's analysis of the buffered versus the porous self being that medieval, self that kind of, specters can get inside of, as it were. And argues that a lot of digital technology and social media and the way that the word functions within social media as opposed to print culture and that sort of thing is actually cultivating a generation of people that have deeper porosity spiritually, as it were, than a previous generation. I think you see something imagined like this in Lewis in it's either the fifth or the seventh letter of the Screwtape Letters, but also narrativized in that hideous strength. One thing Lewis points out, and this is Screwtape, obviously Uncle Screwtape talking to Wormwood. He basically says, demons are kind of hiding themselves these days because everybody's a naturalist, and it's too useful to have naturalists around to like ruin that thing. But perhaps naturalism will actually get weirdly spiritual, and then we'll be able to show up and manifest ourselves again. But everybody's going to call it, well, it's just a force or something like that. And of course, if you read That Hideous Strength, that's effectively what goes on in the novel there. And so one of the things I think is maybe we're getting beyond naturalism, but there's one sense in which I think even in a lot of those kind of witchier versions of whatever naturalism is, um, maybe there's a movement away from a kind of crass materialism, but there's still a naturalism in the sense that it's everything within kind of an immanent frame. Everything's kind of self-contained inside the cosmos. There's not a creator, as it were, outside the cosmos. And in that sense, I think this kind of vague gesturing toward forces and all that sort of thing is on the one hand in a parody scratching of a religious itch, but one that likewise more deeply internalizes a certain element of naturalism. Lewis, interestingly, he does think, nevertheless, there's a spiritual shift that goes on between naturalism 1 and naturalism 2. And so it's not accidental that, for those of you who've read That Hideous Strength, at St. Anne's, which are roughly speaking the good guys, one of the guys that hangs out among St. Anne's is an old 19th century skeptic who's a more old, hard-nosed skeptic, maybe a little bit of a materialist in his instincts. Nevertheless, he kind of keeps the religious folks honest. Whereas this kind of more open to the forces version of a naturalist winds up getting inside much more dangerous projects. And in some sense, we see this right now between the new atheists of a hot minute ago and more modern atheism, such that all of a sudden everybody's freaking out about new atheism, right, in the aughts, and now we're debating gender, and it turns out the new atheists are actually our friends a little bit when it comes to like, hey, men and women really do exist, and there's something objective about that. And so there's kind of interesting shuffling of the tribes, as it were, on a lot of these questions. But I think that's a good question, and I definitely think that while materialism will remain an option in the imagination for a long time, you're definitely getting weirder hybrids. I think what we're going to be able to expect over the next 50 years is every hybrid that you can possibly imagine as an option. And that's definitely going to take various kinds of spiritual forms with different, sliding scale relationships to naturalism.
Sure. I mean, I'm definitely I perceive that we're definitely becoming more and more fragmented, and perhaps that has to do with our internet technological culture, where you can be so specific and have your own specific identity. I mean, people are even thinking that they're determining their own biology and
right.
Finding some unique space. And then I can only imagine it's going to become worse and more and more so. It's kind of tending towards, I guess we might say, irrationality, or the many rather than the one. Joseph, we got a question coming from our YouTube chat. So the question is from Hishmaya77. Can you possibly speak to your modern technoculture proposition and provide an application or perhaps correlation similar to Paul's statement to the Epicureans and Stoics in Acts 17:30? For the sake of everyone, I'll read that. So that's the verse that is, the times of ignorance got overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. I might expand that even more. If any thoughts on any connection to the Epicureans and Stoics and what Paul might think about modern technoculture?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that I find fascinating when Paul, whether it be Romans 1 or Acts 14 or Acts 17, a few authors have noted this in the last century, that there's a way in which natural theological arguments don't work, still work. Yeah, I don't want to be a heretic here. Natural theological arguments still work, but there's this kind of extra layer that makes our culture peculiar, such that they don't ping as obvious to us as it seems like Paul can expect his audience to receive. Like, in him you live and move and have your being. Well, they already kind of think that in some way. Paul is taking something they know in a rough and confused way, and he's clarifying it, but it's something that he can expect to connect with them over in some way. And I think that is still true. Nevertheless, there's a kind of counter signal, such that because as it were, the world signals are jammed a bit, in a sense, and by virtue of our own education and cultivation, those signals are jammed a bit, which doesn't mean we still can't connect with them, but it means, in a sense, we have to both attend to that argument, and there's also, I think, attending to what's jamming the movement, as it were, between pointing at the spheres and pointing at their relationship to us. And so I think those statements of Paul, they're incredibly orienting to me. And in fact, I would even say that you're not really quite grasping reality, and that's to make it too intellectual almost. You're not quite just attuned as a whole person to reality in a fitting way, unless it seems like a very meant thing that you can point at that way and then talk about what does that mean about God. And we can still do apologetics without that attunement to reality. And I think that's the tension. And so I'm kind of putting them together in a maybe it's an inelegant way, but that's in any case how I think about their relationship.
Oh, good. That's helpful. That's good. We've got another AI question here, although not so specific to the tech. This is an interesting launch pad, I think, to a bigger question, perhaps about our ability to think. Going back to the technicism idea, that man and man's technology can kind of transcend himself and save himself. Here's a question from Machen Man. Nice tag. Is it fair to say that AI is constrained in some capacity by ectypal laws of thought, and therefore reveals in some capacity our own irrationalism? Just to interpret for everybody listening or watching, going back to an old post-Reformation Reformed kind of dogmatic category, we typically speak of archetypal and ectypal categories, so those that would apply to God and those that would apply to man as created in God's image. So I guess just to put my own little English or spin on this question, which I think is a really interesting and great question, but I'm trying to broaden it for the sake of everybody watching. Can we create something as mankind, artificial intelligence or otherwise, that would really transcend our own created limitations? That might be another way to get at the question. Anyway, take it any way you would like, though, Joseph.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. And one of the reasons, as I understand it, and here I'm admittedly speaking out of my lane, and those who understand how AI works can do better than me. I think one thing AI mirrors back to us, as it were, is the predictability of our own thoughts. That is to say, it's actually quite rare that you, with the full creative act of the fullness of your mind, utter a sentence that if you were known really, really well, that's actually really, really, really unpredictable. That's generally true of humans already, which is to say that language is prior to thought in some way. You enter into a language, you enter into habits of mind, and that's why when we regurgitate arguments or we present an argument to somebody about something, very often we're presenting not the analogies, the words, the everything as we have received them. And it's rare, in fact, to kind of go above that. And in fact, that's when you know you're talking to a real person, is when all of a sudden it doesn't sound very predictable. You add to that we live in a culture, I think, that trains us into a very predictable habit of mind. We're kind of an engineer people. Engineers are great. I'm glad this house isn't busting over the top of my head and that the ground is solid under my feet and we have all this technology in front of us. Engineering works amazing. But it kind of becomes the pattern of how we think, the kind of mind and the way that engineering works to produce things in material order is the kind of way we organize things in the formal order in theological and philosophical questions, the way we write, the way we argue. Those habits of thought get translated, as it were, I think, into that sphere. And because that's how we think, it becomes especially easy, in a sense, for AI to pull from a million thought patterns that are like that, throw them together, and it sounds like us, because, in a sense, we've already been trained by machines to think like machines, and now machines are feeding our machine thinking back to us in some sense. And I think a really helpful book to get at a really important distinction that I think is often lost is D.C. Schindler, who I think is one of the greatest living philosophers in America. D.C. Schindler's book, Love and the Postmodern Predicament, I think it's published by Cascade 5 or 10 years ago. Love and the Postmodern Predicament, it's a discussion of the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful, and their relationship to reality, basically. Really, really good. But his chapter on truth is especially potent because he captures this sense that the way that we think of truth is very much in terms of data. we're data scientists. There's all this big data stuff out there, information reducible to bits, and we put the bits together, and that's our argument. That's the way we think about things. The more ancient way of grasping the world, or the more ancient sense of just what does it mean to say something is true, is to say my mind is related to the world out there in such a way that the inner intelligible shape of things, in whatever order, in whatever way, in whatever object I'm looking at, is held in me. That what's actually out there, its inner intelligible shape, is manifested in me, and as my mind is postured toward it. And that's very different than having information and data and bits. And I think there is human intellectual work, even types of writing that probably I just don't know I enough well to, maybe I'm over speaking here, but my sense would be there are kinds of habits of thought and ways that a human could think that it would be very hard for AI to recapitulate, even underneath, in a sense, the ectypal order. In other words, I doubt that AI could fill out the whole of ectypal knowledge. I think it could fill out many predictable habits kind of within that epiphenomenal human agency, you might say. But I think the human capacity as such always remains on the frontier of sayability. And there's things that happen on that frontier that I don't think a machine can do ultimately.
I love that. I think we should maybe have a whole AI summit sometime. That would be kind of fun. Do a symposium just on that. Let's.
Beautiful.
It would be useful, because we're on another frontier, and this one could be even more revolutionary than the internet itself. Switching over here, we got another question from Daniel Metcalf. I believe he might have been a former student of yours, but he's asking, can Joseph briefly speak to the hope that he has, or can he sketch out a ground game for the church to engage culture? I guess that's more of the practical question, what we do about these things. Where do we go forth as the church?
Yeah, that really is in some sense, the money question. Yeah. Lewis in Miracles, chapter 6, I think it is, talks about the manner in which the modern world pressures the inheritance of the Christian tradition to be internalized more deeply by a wider swath of the church. So think about this event we're having right now, and the intellectual ecosystems that are represented by and just the church and laity ecosystems that are represented by us interacting even in this room right now, who's watching on YouTube and all that sort of thing. I think what you're seeing is, on the one hand, it makes it a little bit of a Wild West. Everybody is a sort of hodgepodge of all the sources they read and whatever. But what you're seeing, nevertheless, is the raising up of conscious participation in the life of the will and of the life of the mind in the church, in a way that is in some sense a fulfillment of the Reformation desire for an educated population. That's that it's not just kind of the elites that can read, but a wider variety of humans are able to read and to fulfill that aspect of their nature by engaging with God in these questions. And so, in one sense, when I look at the modern world, I see challenges. I see a lot of things that are better than you might experience in other areas. Again, some of this is we just don't have the problems that the past had, and we've forgotten what those problems were. And so it's not that I'm hopeful in the sense that we don't have major challenges that we can't be really harmed. I'm hopeful in the sense that there's good things, there's real opportunities here, and I think it's especially crucial not to code the situation we're in such a way that people are irredeemably caught in simple tribes that can't be penetrated through. And so a big part of, I think, what the Reformation gave the modern world through the development of the public sphere is the movement toward a civilization that's mediated through the mechanisms of persuasion. And that grows. It's not, it doesn't look exactly the same way throughout the early modern to the modern periods, but the growth of the role that persuasion and the mechanisms of persuasion, acting on free humans, in a sense, the role that plays in the holding together of the social order is very prominent in post-Reformation political philosophy. And I think when I think of the modern world, what I find scary in a sense is the hopelessness about the modern world that then becomes this program of descending back into kind of tribal knowledge. Like, obviously those people aren't going to move, aren't going to get persuaded of anything, and both sides, or however many sides there are, treat and project that thing of each other. And yet that's real humans in real time actually do get persuaded. That really happens. And I think this is why, not that I'm not throwing and saying there's no problems with this following person, but I think it's one of the reasons when kind of the Jordan Peterson-like character came on the scene, there was such an interesting reaction, because the style of rhetoric, the style of speaking about reality and truth speaking, in a sense, was very unlike the kind of talking head gotcha pundit, as it were. And I don't know that he's fully escaped some of that as well. Nevertheless, it's fascinating to me how many friends I've seen genuinely move and get persuaded of things when the mechanisms that actually speak to the soul are cultivated in that sense. And so part of the hope, again, when I say hope, I'm pointing to God. I'm not looking out at the world and saying, this looks like it's going well. I'm looking at God and saying, he can do things in this mess. And you can look out and see things that might be done. And so a lot of it is things like this. What excites me is, I work for a group called the Davenant Institute, and I see a new ecosystem of intellectuals and pastors and missionaries and churches and professionals connecting together. And I think holding some social stability and ecclesiastical stability, holding those lines and forging those relationships. And I think that's good for the world of ideas. I could go on and on and on. The last chapter is effectively my answer to that question. And is trying to work that out. And I think there's also just maybe a stubborn sense in me that, like, it's our only option. There isn't, unless you just want to burn it all down and then imagine that what's going to raise from the ashes is a beautiful Christendom. No, it's not. What's going to raise from the ashes of it all being burned down is ancient Near Eastern tribes again. And like, that's bad. It's not you that's going to be running the show. It's somebody you do not want to be running the show that rises up out of the ashes. And so there's a part of me that's like, if we're not doing that, well, then here we just are. And so to not be, it's almost that maybe there's a sense that it would be self-despising of just our peoplehood, our own being, in a sense, not to say, hey, God has put us here and called us in just this world. Let's move forward and make something beautiful of it. And I think Bavinck, I think Eglinton's biography of Bavinck is a really good, in terms of just an exemplar. Reading that biography just gives you a really good sense of Bavinck's sense that I've inherited this tradition. I'm not rejecting the past. I'm not unoriented through the past. And yet here's the modern world of knowing, modern society, modern problems. And I'm trying to put those two things together honestly, while also really being postured toward the future, like it's worth being here and it's worth investing.
Absolutely.
And
I love it. I got another follow-up question here, and then maybe we'll have time for one or two quick ones from the chat. But as you were speaking, and especially early on when you were talking about just the pre-modern economy, and basically what we might call today more like small-town connectedness, and it's becoming more and more difficult to find small towns and small communities where we live. My wife and I really enjoy Wendell Berry. I tend to love his nonfiction. My wife loves his fiction. We both appreciate everything he's written. But one thing that's so important is that if you have a problem with your neighbor now, you just move, or they'll move after a couple of days. You're not forced to have multi-generational interaction with people in the same town for your entire life. And when you are forced to, or that's your only option, is you have to live with or see these people every day when you're going to market or whatever, you live differently and you interact differently. So the question I have is just bringing in two ideas, things that I've been thinking about quite a bit lately for other reasons. One is just the nature of so many of our own work. a lot of us are knowledge workers now, and we don't produce widgets, and we have a harder time connecting what we do and what we produce to tangible outputs. And more than that, how those outputs affect other people. And it might be more difficult to find ourselves in a place in the world, which leads to angst, restlessness, all sorts of other things. But another somewhat tangential idea, but I bear with me, it connects, is an idea that sociologists have identified a notion or an entity called the third place. So we can think of our first place being our home and our second place being our work. The third place is like Cheers on the sitcom, or the diner in the small town. Some people might suggest that coffee shops are a third place, but I don't believe they are presently, because you typically go and you go bringing your laptop to work, or you go to meet someone. You don't go to have an open exchange and a transition from work to home or home to work. And so we have one here in Grays Lake, where a little town where I live, where there's a diner where you go and there are regulars. There are people there that eat every single day, and they're there the same time every day, the same people. And if you're part of that, you're part of that community. It doesn't mean you're the same as everyone else or that you agree with everyone else, but you have an open exchange of ideas. You're forced to get along with people. Otherwise you get kicked out and you can't go eat there anymore. And the third place really is it's a public square where your weird ideas get challenged with everyone else. You also can't be a total jerk. It kind of takes the edges, it rounds down your sharp elbows. So if you have to sit next to someone or have coffee with them, you know you're going to see them tomorrow, you're going to behave yourself and certain things. And all of this seems to me to fit in more or less with the developments, sociological developments that you've identified in your book. And if we think that these new behaviors, then the loss of the third place, the loss of a public square, the change in our labor, the way we work, the way we interact with the world, if we think that's not having an effect on the way we perceive reality, you're crazy. I mean, obviously it has an effect. I'm wondering what you think about that, because I'm asking these things not to just complain about modern life, but to provide perhaps a more accurate diagnosis and a prognosis, so that we can think as Christians how then we bring the hope of the gospel to a world where everyone constructs their own reality and doesn't have to interact with anyone else.
Yeah, and this is the kind of thing you're pointing to there helps emphasize that the solution, as it were, to a lot of these things is conscious strategies you have to take. In other words, if life isn't just going to reinforce what formerly was just there, in a sense, to be oriented, you have to reorient yourself. This is, by the way, why exercise exists these days. Like, people didn't used to go work out because they just worked. And now you can sit at a desk all day. Well, it's like your body needs to move. And so we've come up with this thing called exercise. I'm not very good at it, but nevertheless, humans who are doing better than me at this exercise their body, in a sense, to recapitulate what the body would normally be getting. And the same thing with our relationships, what the role that these elective sites of common human connection, Richard Sennett writes a lot about this and just urban design and city planning stuff. Cultivating sites of common human connection is an essential thing in the modern world, and the prioritization of contact with people. And I think this is a huge thing. Lewis, again, I keep quoting Lewis, but he has this famous quote in The Weight of Glory that your neighbor is the most sacred object you see in any given day. And one of the things I want to emphasize in the text is that, like, what if you're that wage slave who works in a job and you can't get out of it, and you're in the city and everything is against everything we're talking about here. You're never going to even be able to 1/10 do the Wendell-Berry thing. You are in a radically non-Wendell-Berry existence and you can't get out of it. What I think you can do, going back to recognizing, okay, my reality signals are all jammed in some way because of all these noises, you can nevertheless recognize that at any point that I am encountering a human face, I am actually encountering that thing in creation which shines above all else and is actually the chief icon of God's being to me. And I think the cultivation, and it's funny because the Wendell Berry thing can very often be a way to get away from faces. Like, like let me go live in the, let me go reorient by getting away from people. And I think Paul talks a lot to slaves in the New Testament. Paul talks to a lot of people in the New Testament who are in very vulnerable circumstances, and he gives them a calling and an agency from which no circumstance can alienate you. And the vocation of love, the vocation of taking my circumstance and my gifts and plugging them into a place that I'm just in God's calling, is that vocation from which no wage slavery or any circumstance can alienate you. And the removal of all those things, maybe as a historical condition or whatever, I think doesn't take away the chief sight of reorientation, whether that just be your own soul, but in the world, is just the face of other people. And there's a gaze, in a sense, I think the New Testament is trying to cultivate in you, that in a sense the rest is epiphenomenal of, and that actually helps you like think now of the faces of the world, in a sense, think of the world as more this, which is actually the old view that kind of man is the microcosm of the whole. Man is actually the paradigm of which everything else is, an echo, and that sort of thing. Yeah, so I think those sites are enormously important, but they do have to be chosen, and I think they are that without which our order will fall apart. Our social order, our civilizational order, depends very deeply on sites where mutual trust at the almost lizard brain level, as it were, can actually be forged prior to simple, agreement about politics or something like that. America's never had agreement about politics. That's not who we are.
Absolutely. So much of it also is still just market driven. The way things are marketed in business, there's only two ways to make money. It's either by competing on price or differentiation. And if you're not going to be the low cost provider for whatever you're offering, you have to get people to believe you're different. And when we live in a world of the other and a disintegrating public square, no third places, you just move toward the fringes. And this is why we're seeing like cable news have such difficulty, because they were the ones on the outside for a while. They were different because they weren't broadcast. But then you end up with like Newsmax and Breitbart and all these others, because they're trying to outright the right, and the out left, MSNBC's getting out lefted by, whomever. And it just goes on, and it just keeps moving further and further outside because everyone wants to differentiate. So it's a wild idea. Anyway, enough of my pet peeves, my pet projects. I want at least to ask one more question, maybe two. Here's a quick one from Eric Lichtenberg. He's asking you, Dr. Minik, are we seeing a movement away from Enlightenment distinctives? What do you think about that?
That's hard to answer, partially because I think probably Enlightenment discourse, like many labels like evangelical, Enlightenment, whatever, is it's a little hard for me to fully map that onto a concrete reality. There's kind of like, I think and this isn't me just trying to be like, well, actually, but there's many enlightenments and there's many things we could think that means. But but in the sense of like, what Carl Trueman points out, Rousseau, right? The rise and triumph of the modern self. In some sense, I think we're still more deeply internalizing the modern self and the radicalness of the individual. One thing I would say, and this is maybe where I'm willing to speak a little controversial, and I do in the book actually say this, is I think there is a Christian version of a focus on the individual. I think there's a redemption. In one sense, of course, you can go back in the history of ideas and say the development of the very concept of the individual is a fallout of Trinitarian controversies. It gets taken up, it becomes more socially significant, etc. The Reformation plays a role in this. The Enlightenment, in a sense, does something with it that unhinges the individual in a way that obviously we would want to be critical of. And yet, I don't think in God's providence that's, there's a plundering of the Egyptians to go on there in some sense. And one thing to say there is we just are actually, whether we like it or not, in fact, phenomenologically, way more radically individual in our identity than our ancestors. So even if we're Reformed, say, like, where did you get your Reformed theology? It's not because you had the same Sunday school teacher in the same town. It's because you read your script for whatever you think and how you got there is different from every other person in a pretty radical way. We're all hodgepodges these days, in some sense. So, and this is part of the reason why it's hard to say, like, what does reformed mean? Because the right, on the one hand, you can point to the confessions, but even there, the understanding of the confessions, part of the issue is people learn it all very individualistically. And so when you get together to talk, there's nuances of difference that are just always there because of, in a sense, the material conditions within which we learn. And so it's hard for me to say that the individualism of the Enlightenment isn't becoming in some way more internalized, but I guess I want to add the little cherry on top that I actually think there's something to be redeemed there, because it's the radical individual choosing to go back to reality and to say, I'm here, I'm a little unhinged, but there is gravity out there. And the world isn't pulling me back into that gravity, but I can, as it were, decide. And our communities can decide to orient ourselves to those things and then help kind of hold it together, as it were.
Mm-hmm. We have one more question before me.
Yep.
Certainly you can add any additional comment that you'd like, but the last question I'd like to ask was submitted by Carl Gobelman, a good friend of ours. How would the arguments you lay out in your book fit into the preacher's or Kohelet's argument in Ecclesiastes? He says, it really seems to me there's a lot of chasing after the wind in the world today. Any thoughts on this ancient?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and reminds me how much I've for a long time been wanting to do a deeper analysis of Ecclesiastes, because it is fascinating that language can be spoken, in the thousands of 3,000 years ago. We can already speak like in a very angsty way, as it were. Yeah, I think in one sense, what requires a journey of mind for the wisest person in the world to get to in the context of Ecclesiastes is maybe gestures at and points to certain kinds of realities, or certain moods even, that maybe are through the accidents of our providence and material culture, default settings for a lot of modern people. So that sense of like, what's it all about around here? You can begin to enter that kind of headspace as your first access point to discourse. It's not a thing you arrive at on the top of all the meaning around me. It's a mood that's, the very stories we have. It's interesting to think, like, what's it like to be a child, grow up in the modern world, and so many stories don't have that simple structure of a moral tale where there's a hero and they're connected to reality and they do a thing, but that people are kind of like depressed, or having an existential crisis, and like that's quite literally literature and film, and and I'm not knocking that in any sense, but I suppose and I'm really shooting from the hip, I should say, as well. But I think my intuition is to say that there's ways in which Ecclesiastes is a grammar that we enter into almost by default. Whereas it's maybe it would feel more like an exercise of the imagination and mind for different kinds of communities. And of course, it is Solomon presenting sort of a thing that's at the height of his knowledge and wisdom. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's at least a gesture.
I love it. No, that's wonderful. Very, 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 very well said. I appreciate this, and our time's about up. We'll certainly keep the conversation going. We'll keep an eye on comments and chats, and certainly, Joseph, would love to keep talking with you as well. But I want everyone to know we've got the book before us, Bulwarks of Unbelief, Atheism and Divine Absence in a Secular Age, by our guest today, Dr. Joseph Minik. We also have a 40% discount coupon available from Lexham, the publisher. Visit lexhampress.com/reformed-forum for a 40% discount and free U.S. shipping. The coupon is valid through March 31st, 2024. So you have a month to pull the trigger on that. Joseph, thanks so much. This has been really fun. We really appreciate it.
Oh,
Thanks for
my pleasure. Thanks
writing
for
the
having
book, you bet, and for sharing with our viewers today. This has been a tremendous way to start the sessions, and we look forward to a full day. We've got 2 more today, but Joseph, we hope you're more than welcome to hang on with us and stick with us in the additional sessions. But everyone else, stay tuned. We've got another session lined up soon. We're going to be welcoming Owen Anderson at 2 p.m. Eastern. Again, if you're watching after the fact, it's over, but we are presently living in February 29th, 2024, and at 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern, we'll have Owen Anderson speaking about Old Princeton and secularism. Thanks, everyone, for watching so far, and stay in touch. Stay on YouTube. Head on over to reformedforum.org/symposium for more information. We're going to stop this session as it is right now, but we'll still be online, and we'll be back later at 2 p.m. Okay, the stream is done. Well done. That was awesome.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.